From 1914 to 1918, nearly 80 million people were plunged into a war the likes of which the world had never seen. The scale of the death and destruction was unimaginable, leaving 18 million dead and 20 million injured. Nearly every major superpower would be pulled into the conflict. New, devastating weapons, the likes of which the world had never seen, would be used on an industrial scale. And the political landscape of Europe would be changed forever. But for the first time in human history, the chaos and destruction of war could be accurately documented. For 4 years, brave cameramen from around the world risked their lives to capture these images. This is World War I in color. Vienna, 1914. There hasn't been a major European conflict in almost 50 years. After centuries of war, the powerful empires of Europe are finally at peace. The great writer Stefan Zweig recalls Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. New theaters, libraries and museums were springing up everywhere. There was progress everywhere. What could interrupt this rapid ascent, dampen the alarm, which constantly drew new force from its own soaring? A wondrous, carefree spirit reigns the world over. Never has Europe been stronger, richer, more beautiful, or more confident of an even better future. But this poetic rendition of a unified, carefree Europe was not seen by all. For the working classes, daily life in 1914 means toil and hardship. Workers put in twice the hours as those of today, yet earn half as much. Women and children as young as 12 were also put to work, but earned half the men's wage, despite doing the same jobs and working the same hours. In every country, tensions between the rich and poor were growing, but cries for reform were largely being ignored. In France, Jean Jaurès is the great leader of the working class. He is worried. He knows that among Europe's elite, many captains of industry speak openly of a war to end the movement for workers' demands. Jaurès writes, "Your violent and chaotic society, even when it pretends to seek peace, carries within it war, just as rain clouds carry the storm." Jaurès's fears were justified. Despite the fragile peace, the great European powers prepared for war. For centuries, the rival empires have been dividing the world with their swords. And they were always looking to expand. Britain's conquests reach as far as Australia and Canada. France's from Indochina to Africa. Germany also has some colonies, but has ambitions to grow larger. Prior to 1871, Prussia was a divided state. By crushing France and annexing the French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, it has become the German Empire. The Emperor of Germany, Wilhelm II, is married to his cousin, Augusta Victoria. They have the same grandmother, the British sovereign Queen Victoria. At her death, Queen Victoria's descendants occupied many of Europe's thrones. The Europe of kings and emperors is one big family. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II, the British sovereign King George V, and the Russian Tsar Nicholas II are all cousins. Peace should reign in the family. But in each country, strong national factions see war as the opportunity to finish off a dangerous rival. Wilhelm has a conflicted relationship with his English royal family, so powerful and dominating. And since forming the Triple Alliance with France and Russia, the British Empire has become even more of a threat. A surrounded Germany now feels vulnerable. So the German Kaiser gathers his military leaders and orders the building of a navy that will surpass England's fleet. He wants to give Germany its place in the sun. Germany's only true ally is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a collection of smaller nations which has been reigned over for 60 years by Franz Joseph I. His long life has been punctuated by tragedy. The suicide of his son and the assassination of his wife, Empress Elizabeth. Sisi, as she was known, was the sweetheart of his youth. He is now an old emperor, many of whose subjects demand independence. He rules a tinderbox. But Franz Joseph and his arrogant officers and politicians oppose reform of any kind. In 1908, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had expanded its borders with the annexation of Bosnia. The move was not popular in the region, especially to its neighbor Serbia, who wanted to expand its own territories by uniting the people of the Balkans. Though the Bosnian crisis was quickly resolved, tensions between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire remained high. With no living male heirs, it is the Austrian Kaiser's nephew Franz Ferdinand who will inherit the empire after his uncle's death. Franz Ferdinand is married to the Countess Sophie Chotek, an aristocrat, but not of royal blood. Franz Joseph does not approve, nor does he approve of the reformist ideas of his heir. His empire is referred to as the Joyful Apocalypse. But no one could foresee that events here could change the world forever. In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ruled by Kaiser Franz Joseph, was one of the world's great superpowers. But strong nationalist factions often made its territories unstable, and the newly annexed region of Bosnia was no exception. 28th of June 1914. Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is on tour in Sarajevo to inspect the imperial troops. The annexation of Bosnia was opposed by many countries in the region, especially Serbia, who wanted to expand its own territories by uniting the Slavic people of the Balkans. Initially, the inspection is going well, but as they return to City Hall, the Archduke and his wife narrowly escape an assassination attempt when a homemade bomb is thrown at their car. Without adequate protection, they abandon their visit. But as they attempt to flee, they unwittingly drive by one of the would-be assassins and are both shot. The second assassination attempt is a success. The assassin, Gavrilo Princip, is a 19-year-old Bosnian nationalist. His weapons were supplied by the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist group. The Austrian Kaiser, Franz Joseph, was at his country estate hunting at the time. There, he learns that the heir to the throne, his nephew, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife have been assassinated in Sarajevo. Showing no trace of emotion, the Kaiser coldly announces, "A higher power has re-established the order which I, alas, could not preserve." This assassination in Sarajevo will have unimaginable consequences. Though at first, it is covered as a minor news story. Along the Thames, the future queen of the mystery novel, Agatha Christie, then 24, notes, When in far-off Serbia an archduke was assassinated, it seems such a far-away incident. In those countries, people were always being assassinated. The British paid scant attention to the black hole of Europe, known as the Balkan powder keg. In 1912, 2 Balkan wars had left 200,000 dead. By 1914, in Great Britain, those distant tragedies have been forgotten. The English monarch, George V, is also the King of Ireland and the Emperor of India. His realm is huge, but his powers limited. His foremost preoccupation is Ireland's struggle for independence. On the 28th of June 1914, he writes, "The assassination in Sarajevo is one more shock for the old Emperor of Austria." George V has no sense of what is about to explode, any more than the President of France, who has come to London on an official visit to reaffirm the Entente Cordiale, the new friendship, which, after centuries of deadly rivalry, now links Great Britain and France. Poincaré may be a moderate, but he comes from the Lorraine region that Germany annexed, and that all France now dreams of reconquering. The 3rd of July 1914. With the funerals of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie Chotek, the countdown to war begins. Austria's generals have long sought an excuse to subjugate Serbia. They cannot prove the country's responsibility for the Sarajevo assassinations, but they managed to convince their emperor. The Austrian chief of staff declares, "We must rid ourselves of the Serbs, for they are forever biting the heel of the empire like snakes." But such a stance overlooks Russia, protector of the Slavs. St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire, is the seat of Tsar Nicholas II, who has reigned over his 170 million subjects for 30 years. He celebrates the tricentennial of the Russian dynasty amid the pomp of the Orthodox Church. Parading alongside him, Tsarina Alexandra and their son, Tsarevich Alexei. And close behind, their 4 daughters, the Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. In 1905, Russia lost a war against Japan and experienced its first revolution. Since then, the country's economy has improved, despite the burden of high military expenditures. In early July of 1914, amid Europe's looming misfortunes, the Tsar takes a cruise on the Baltic Sea aboard his yacht. Despite these carefree images, the Tsar feels a deep sense of insecurity. Peace is under threat. And so is his dynasty. His heir, his sole son, the 10-year-old Tsarevich Alexei, is a hemophiliac. His blood does not clot. The slightest injury may be fatal. To ward off the ill fortune that has plunged her into depression, his mother, the Tsarina, seeks help from a faith-healing monk, Rasputin, whose influence is on the rise. Rasputin may help the Tsarevich, but he also meddles in the affairs of the Tsar. But while the Tsar and his family distract themselves from the growing problems in Europe, In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II soon learns of the death of Franz Ferdinand and his wife. To the Kaiser, the assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne is the most serious threat of all, an attack on the divine right of kings. Wilhelm II had often hunted with Franz Ferdinand. The Archduke was a close friend, and for the Kaiser, a naive and impulsive man, the assassination is nothing short of sacrilege. Wilhelm II, his generals, and the German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg all agree Germany must not waver, but must seize the opportunity of the assassination in Sarajevo to demonstrate Germany's will. Together, they decide to support their ally Austria in its plan to invade Serbia. On the 6th of July 1914, the threat of war doesn't keep Wilhelm II from leaving for a summer cruise on his yacht. An 8,000-ton, 100-meter-long Leviathan. Wilhelm is confident that the conflict will not spread. He says, "It will all be over in a week. The Tsar won't enter the war because Russia is unprepared, and its ally France has no heavy artillery." On the 20th of July 1914, the President of the French Republic, Raymond Poincaré, arrives in Russia. Poincaré, a secular Republican, has no qualms about supporting an absolute monarch and profoundly religious man like Nicholas II. The visit has been planned long ago. With the crisis, the timing is perfect. Poincaré wants to assess the solidarity of the alliance and the readiness of Russia's army. The French president issues a cautious statement. The current crisis must remain limited to Serbia. But as France's leaders prepare to return to Paris, the government cancels all leave for military personnel and calls all generals back from holiday. While the wealthy enjoy their seaside vacations and ignore concerns about Sarajevo, the continent continues its descent into war. The Austrians prepare. On the 23rd of July 1914, the government in Vienna sends Belgrade an ultimatum, with a provision that its imperial police be allowed to investigate on Serbian territory. Belgrade answers back, Serbia is not a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria's ultimatum to Serbia means war for the entire world. The President of the United States, the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, is an intellectual and a pacifist. He wants to preserve America's neutrality. He says, "I want to keep the United States out of a European war." In Canada, fear of war is headline news. Herbert Asquith, the British Prime Minister, fears an escalation of unforeseeable dimensions. He says, "We are on the brink of the apocalypse." Its ultimatum having been rejected, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. On the 28th of July 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Austrian artillery's Skoda cannons enter into action against Belgrade. And Russia, given its alliance with Serbia, sends its troops to the Austro-Hungarian border. On the 30th of July 1914, Wilhelm II cuts short his cruise. Given his alliance with Austria, he issues an ultimatum to his cousin, Nicholas II, ordering him to withdraw his troops from the Austrian border. Nicholas, on the contrary, mobilizes. He writes to his cousin and ally, George V of England. I do not know what may happen. Austria has gone off upon a reckless war, which can easily end in a general conflagration. Wilhelm II, not having received a response to his ultimatum, hesitates. He speaks of saving the peace. But around him, military leaders and industrialists urge him to declare war, blaming Russia for expanding the conflict. On the 1st of August 1914, Germany mobilizes and declares war on Russia. On the 1st of August 1914, in response to Russian aggression against its ally Austria-Hungary, the German Kaiser declares war on Russia and begins to mobilize his troops. Young German recruits examine the contents of their infantry kits, which include the indispensable extra pairs of socks. Barely men, they are issued rifles, bayonets, and, a symbol of the German army, the spiked helmet, meant to deflect saber blows. Most are eager to defend their threatened homeland. As the future writer Ernst Junger notes, we had come from classrooms and factory workbenches, and a few brief weeks of training had bonded us into one large and enthusiastic group. In St. Petersburg, Russians, now at war, sing the imperial anthem that begins, "God protect the Tsar." The French ambassador is present. He writes, "The Tsar is overcome with emotion. His people have invested him with a divine mission. He is the absolute master of their bodies and souls." The Tsarina appears. Of German descent, she is worried. Her brother will no doubt be fighting in the enemy's ranks. Rasputin cables Nicholas II. "With war will come the end of Russia and yourselves, and you will lose to the last man." In a final carefree moment, Parisians await the arrival of the Tour de France. The race begins on the same day as the assassination in Sarajevo, as these cycling champions cover 3,400 miles in 1 month, finishing just before the war halts the tour for the next 4 years. The winner is the Belgian great Philippe Thies of the Peugeot team. 1st of August 1914. Les Halles, the legendary food market, the heart and soul of the French capital, wakes up in mourning. Not far from here, Jean Jaurès has just been assassinated by an ultra-nationalist supporter of the war. Pacifism's leading spokesman, Jaurès, had tried to convince German workers to refuse to fight. He had predicted, at a time when we are threatened with murder and butchery, there is but one hope of saving the peace, and that is for the proletariats to join ranks. Workers of France, England, Germany, Italy, Russia. Let us implore these millions of men to unite to dispel this horrible nightmare. On the 2nd of August 1914, the order for general mobilization is posted across all of France. On holiday in Brittany, Louis Morfray, a medical student, describes the moment. It's a fine late summer afternoon. I hear the tiny bell of the cathedral ringing insistently. Everyone stops. We have understood. The women weep. The men, frozen, look at the cathedral spire, dazed and speechless. It's war. In the distance, we can hear the bells of Viviers, Mont d'Or, Carfantin, and Baguier-Morvan. It's heart-wrenching. On the 3rd of August 1914, Paris learns that Germany has declared war on France because France is an ally of Russia. That same day, Jaurès is buried, and with him, all hope for peace. In France, Germany and Russia, workers rally to defend their homelands. Poincaré baptizes this triumph of the nationalist forces the Sacred Union. "3 million Frenchmen are mobilized, following 5 million Russians, 4 million Germans, and 2 million Austrians. About all these men, Stefan Zweig writes, "In 1914, what did they know of war after nearly half a century of peace? It had become a heroic and romantic legend. People saw it through the perspective of their school books and the paintings in museums. Brilliant cavalry attacks in glittering uniforms. A resounding march of victory with nary a victim. A wild, manly adventure, a wonderful and exciting experience. That is why they shouted and sang in the trains carrying them to the slaughter." If they are not happy, they prefer not to show it. In Toulouse, a young farmer, Henri de Perrière, writes, "Any sign of sadness was banished. We swaggered before our fellow countrymen." From the French colonial empire, those then known as the natives and the Foreign Legion embark from Algiers or Dakar. Packed into boats almost as crowded as the slave ships of the past, they dance for the camera as they sail toward a world of the unknown. These farmers, off to defend their country, expect a return before the harvest is over. On the 3rd of August 1914, the Germans attack. They count on a rapid victory and a brief war. Their plan, known as the Schlieffen Plan, after the German general who devised it, consists of crossing Luxembourg and Belgium before the Russians attack from the east and force the Germans to fight on two fronts. Belgian neutrality had been instituted after the defeat of Napoleon to create a buffer between Britain, France and Germany. Its violation now provokes an immediate reaction from London. England declares war on Germany. In London, on the 4th of August 1914, on the balcony at Buckingham Palace, King George V says, "It is a terrible catastrophe, but it is not our fault. Please God, it may soon be over." The German High Command calculates that the British won't have time to reach the continent. The Belgian campaign will be over very quickly. But the Belgians stand firm. Albert I, their valiant king, tells his people, "A country that defends itself cannot perish." The Belgians have armored trains and strong defenses protecting their cities. For the Germans, it is an unpleasant surprise. They fall several days behind on their battle plan. To crush the fortresses, they must use the local railways to bring in their huge Krupp cannons that fire 1-ton shells. So the Belgians destroy their train tracks by crashing their own locomotives into each other. Forcing the Germans to lose time on lengthy repairs. While the Germans waste time in Belgium and the Russians prepare their offensive, the Austro-Hungarians, who expected to punish the Serbs in a week, are stopped in their tracks. The Serbs prove to be fearsome combatants. After 2 weeks, the Austrian death toll has already reached 25,000, and the Serbs celebrate their victory, for now. All this gives the British Empire time to mobilize. The world's largest navy goes into action. At its head, a young cabinet minister named Winston Churchill. Great Britain does not have an obligatory military service and needs volunteers. This poster of Field Marshal Kitchener, the hero of Khartoum, proclaims, "Your country needs you," a cry echoed by the country's recruiting officers. The modest British army of 100,000 men expands into an expeditionary force of 1 million soldiers, drawn from the Empire's huge reserves. In Quebec, recruits kiss the scriptures and say their prayers, thinking about the long sea crossing that lies ahead. These departures will become the inspiration for a heart-rending novel, War Horse, by Michael Morpurgo. It recounts the battlefield odyssey of Joey the farm horse. Joey, who can speak, says he was chosen because he was judged sound as a bell, fit for anything, cavalry or artillery. "10 million horses from as far away as Australia and New Zealand will serve in the British Imperial Forces, to suffer and die like the troops." Many of the horses are not even saddle broken and have to be quickly trained for life on the front. Joey the warhorse declares confidently, "The soldiers are buoyant with optimism, as if they were embarking on some great military picnic." But the high spirits and laughter amongst these young men quickly fades as they discover the reality of war. The first casualties. The first prisoners. And the realization that the conflict would not be over as quick as any of them had believed. But the early months of the war would be nothing compared to the horror that would follow. August 1914. The German army had counted on a series of rapid victories in Belgium, leaving the way clear for an all-out assault on Paris. But they had massively underestimated the level of Belgian resistance they would face, and their advance falls weeks behind schedule. Using this time, the French launched their own counter-offensive, known as Plan 17. Take back Alsace and Lorraine before marching on Berlin. Their first objective, Mulhouse in Alsace. On the 7th of August 1914, the French take Mulhouse. This triumphant parade is staged for the newsreels. It features school children, bouquets of flowers, and patriotic outpourings from people in traditional Alsatian clothing. The French army of August 1914. The infantry is made up mostly of large battalions, as in the time of Napoleon, with uniforms unsuited for modern warfare. Their conspicuous red trousers are easily spotted by the enemy, and their lack of a helmet makes them vulnerable. They swelter under thick woolen greatcoats in the stifling August heat. They must carry a heavy haversack and the famous Lebel rifle that weighed 11 pounds. But the Lebel, like the German Mauser and the British Lee Enfield, has a firepower never before seen. These repeating rifles, with a range of over 1,200 feet, render the classic military tactic of closed ranks and bayonet charges obsolete. But military academies still taught these outdated tactics and end up costing hundreds of thousands of human lives. Three days after the filming of these scenes, the French troops are driven out of Mulhouse by a counter-offensive. The Germans then turn their machine guns on the local populace, whom they accuse of committing hostile acts towards the Kaiser's troops. In Belgium too, the Germans have launched their strategy of reprisals. Their atrocities escalate. They are afraid of civilian marksmen. Anyone captured who is believed to be a sniper is shot. As with soldiers everywhere, alcohol numbs the horror and helps spread tall tales. Fear of reprisals sends hundreds of thousands of civilians into flight. Belgians, French and British accuse the Huns, as they call their enemies, of rape of cutting off women's breasts and children's hands. On the 20th of August 1914, General von Moltke captures Brussels. He explains, "Our advance in Belgium is certainly brutal, but we are fighting for our lives, and all who get in the way must suffer the consequences." The Germans destroy historical monuments, lay waste to Louvain, the city known as the Belgian Oxford, and burn its medieval university and irreplaceable library. After only 3 weeks of war, all the adversaries are in the grips of indescribable hatred. In Belgium, a French cavalryman writes, "I enter a house, climb the stairs, and discover a German pig relieving himself in a drawer full of delicate lace. I shoot him. He dies in his own filth. Everything has been ransacked. The lowest instincts have awoken in these Germans, these music lovers." In the east, contrary to German plans, the Russians have crossed the border and entered East Prussia. And now it is the Germans who begin to flee, what they call the Russian steamroller. On the 22nd of August 1914, panic sets in. These German refugees also tell of destruction and pillaging. People are afraid. Uncertainty reigns. Kaiser Wilhelm II switches between despondency and martial enthusiasm. His paranoia worsens. He insists, "England, France, and Russia have agreed among themselves to wage a war of extermination against us." But the Germans are confident. They have just won 2 major victories at Mons and Charleroi, capturing thousands of prisoners. On the 22nd of August, 27,000 French soldiers are killed. It is the single deadliest day in all of French military history. Wilhelm II addresses his subjects.
Wir werden uns wehren bis zum letzten Hauch von Mann und Ross. Und wir werden diesen Kampf bestehen, auch gegen eine Welt von Feinden. Noch nie war Deutschland überwunden, wenn es einig war.
The German army marches on Paris. Despite delays, the Schlieffen Plan is succeeding. The French government has fled the capital. The Germans are now only 30 miles from Paris. Victory is near. August the 27th, 1933, East Prussia. Adolf Hitler and Hermann Goering, both veterans of World War I, paid tribute to Field Marshal von Hindenburg in the awe-inspiring setting of the monument to the Battle of Tannenberg. Hitler declares, "Tannenberg is a symbol. It was here, in 1914, that Germany's destiny was determined." For Hindenburg, 20 years earlier, the Battle of Tannenberg had been the defining event of his life and of the First World War. Millions of men are caught in the machinery of a war that will be short and glorious, or so the generals and heads of state promise. Instead, the war becomes one of deadlock and fear. Fear on the home front. As the Germans advance on Paris, there's a run on the banks to empty personal accounts. Many flee, storming train stations. Thousands of refugees from Belgium, northern France, and the Champagne region flee the advancing Germans. The war forces families from their homes, from their lives. The same panic strikes East Prussia in northern Germany, where the Russians have attacked. Rumors spread. They plunder and rape. In movie theaters, German propaganda features a villain, the Russian rapist, in film after film, terrorizing audiences. But the Russian advance is orderly. The generals execute their strategic plan, opening a new front which eases the pressure on their French ally. The Russian steamroller, as it is called, made up of two imperial armies totaling 400,000 men, threatens Berlin. Russian soldiers, prepared to die, sing farewell to their country. In his novel, August 1914, the famous Russian writer Solzhenitsyn describes the buoyant mood. The regiment is a sort of village, the officer a sort of squire. And so long as meals, mass and vodka are offered, bullets hold no terror for them. On the 20th of August 1914, the Russian army advances through East Prussia, seemingly invincible. Along with thousands of civilians, the German 8th Army retreats. General von Hindenburg takes over command. To reassure the public, the general is filmed in conversation with Kaiser Wilhelm II. Hindenburg is seconded by General Ludendorff, who has earned praise for the Belgian campaign. Hindenburg and Ludendorff appear unconcerned. They make a formidable team. As Hindenburg puts it, it is a happy marriage. Hindenburg and Ludendorff know they are outnumbered. They have only 200,000 men under their command, half as many as the Russians. But they are better armed and can move their troops more efficiently through strategic rail transport. Morale among the troops is high. Many of them come from East Prussia. They are defending their homeland. Ludendorff deploys the inventions of Count Zeppelin, huge hydrogen-filled airships that enable him to observe enemy movements. The Germans are able to transmit vital information. The two Russian armies are too far apart to come to each other's aid. The time is right for a German attack, starting with General Samsonov's army, which is nearing Tannenberg. In 3 days, the Germans take 90,000 prisoners. 30,000 Russians are killed or wounded. General Samsonov tells his officers, "The Tsar trusted me. How can I face him after such a disaster?" Then he shoots himself in the head. The second Russian army is decimated in turn. The defeat is a terrible blow to Russia's French and British allies, who seek to cover it up. German refugees from East Prussia return to their villages, but rarely their homes. To boost spirits, the Germans film the surviving troops, who receive triple rations. 10,000 of their fellow comrades have fallen in battle. Hindenburg is named Field Marshal. He becomes a national hero. Ludendorff, the real architect of the victory, is overlooked. With such decisive victories, spirits in Germany are high, and their advance towards Paris seems unstoppable. After a crushing defeat at Tannenberg that left 90,000 Russians captured and 30,000 dead, Tsar Nicholas II, in his special train, sitting camouflaged in a birch forest, meets his uncle, the commander-in-chief of his armies, Grand Duke Nicholas. An authoritarian giant, he plays down the disaster at Tannenberg. For him, the real enemy is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He says the war started in Austria. The way to Berlin lies through Austria-Hungary. The Russians are able to conquer Galicia, at the time an Austrian province, and its main city, Lemberg. The Cossack cavalry advances 120 miles. Austria loses 400,000 men, killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Nicholas II's smile of satisfaction after this initial victory against the Austrians masks the loss of 200,000 Russian soldiers in 3 weeks of war. To the west, on a front 370 miles long, 7 German armies, 2 million men in all, invade France. The first army of General von Kluck crosses the Somme River, the last natural line of defense before the capital. The German officers rally their troops, saying, "Victory is close. The triumphant entry into Paris awaits you." The German infantrymen have marched 250 miles since the heavy fighting in Belgium of early August 1914. The commander of the Brandenburg Regiment tells them, "We must allow the enemy no rest. Sweat saves blood." Even as they retreat, the French continue the fight. They are at the limits of their endurance. The heat is unbearable. it is the hottest summer of the century. Few men have washed or taken off their boots for a month. Blood oozes from the backs of the horses that are seldom unsaddled. It is an orderly retreat by the French and British. The 1st Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment, which arrived in France on the 13th of August, has marched 185 miles. They assemble to hear the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, Field Marshal Sir John French, tell them that the situation is grave. All around Paris, the defense forces organize, using any and every means. But on the 2nd of September 1914, 2 French aviators returned from a reconnaissance flight over enemy lines. The German forces are changing direction. Rather than carry on to Paris, the German armies swerve in an attempt to encircle the French army, thus opening themselves to an attack by the French and British along the Marne River. The commander of the forces defending Paris, General Gallieni, orders the swift transport of 6,000 men to the Marne. In Parisian taxicabs. A huge propaganda operation which the government has filmed to boost French morale. The Marne River taxis are hailed as the saviors of Paris, though their contribution to the battle is minimal. They carry only a fraction of the million Frenchmen preparing for battle. The French commander-in-chief is General Joffre. On the 6th of September 1914, he has his officers read the day's orders to his soldiers advancing to the front. At the moment when a battle is about to begin, upon which hangs the fate of France, a troop that cannot advance must at any cost hold on to the conquered ground and be killed there rather than retreat. No weakness can be tolerated. The soldiers are afraid. They know that court-martials await those who waver. If they retreat, they will be executed by their own. If they advance, they will be killed by the enemy. Among them is one of France's greatest poets, Charles Piggy. The 41-year-old lieutenant is killed by a bullet to his forehead. A Christian socialist and patriot, he had written these verses. Blessed are those who died in a just war. Blessed the ripe wheat, the wheat gathered in sheaves. Blessed are those who died in great battles, stretched out on the ground in the face of God. French artillery units proved to be extremely effective, thanks to the 75mm cannon, which can fire 20 rounds a minute. It consumes an astronomical number of shells, some 100,000 shells a day, 200 million shells for the entire war. They are manufactured by women who work in miserable conditions. On the 9th of September, after 3 days of fighting, the French and British are victorious, but only after carnage on a terrible scale. The fighting has left 200,000 dead or wounded on the French side, and just as many Germans. young women from comfortable families sign up as nurses. Known as angels of mercy, they are wrestled from a sheltered adolescence and must learn to endure the terrible screams of mutilated young men and the constant, unbearable odor of blood, ether, and gangrene. But the unimaginable number of wounded and dead does not deter military and political leaders. Ever since they landed in the south of France, the African troops of the French colonies have been marching north. During the course of the war, France alone will draft over 500,000 troops from all over Africa. They will be deployed in almost every major battle, and many will never make it home. General Joffre, decorating colonial troops, proclaims, "As their cruel but glorious losses testify, the native infantrymen have admirably carried out their duty." Curiously, patriotism among the troops also remains high. Despite the slaughter, they think the war will end soon. Private Pierre Brugier writes to his wife, "I have not given up hope of returning this November. I cannot imagine that the nations involved can keep up their incredible effort much longer." The French have taken 25,000 German prisoners and, like all the belligerents, film them as a tangible sign of victory. Troops view their captives with curiosity mixed with hatred. Henri Desperrières, a 21-year-old soldier from the south of France, says, "It's the first time I see them up close. My cartridges weigh heavy in my pockets. I long to plug a few Prussian bellies with them." Altogether, the POWs are treated rather well on both sides. The International Committee of the Red Cross creates the Prisoners of War Agency. It will deliver 10 billion letters and parcels over the course of the conflict. The French are permitted a brief period of rest. The colonel, the father to his regiment, expresses his concern for the survivors. "How is the stew, soldier?" is the standard phrase. They have saved Paris. But a young cavalry officer, René Chambre, writes, "The Battle of the Marne. We won the battle and lost the victory." The French and the British allow the Germans to flee towards the north of France in a series of outflanking maneuvers known as the Race to the Sea. During those 3 months of battle, other German units complete their conquest of Belgium. The German military seeks to win over the local inhabitants. But the plundering and requisitions to feed the soldiers quickly spell starvation for Belgian citizens. Among these German soldiers is an obscure Austrian painter who is enlisted in the German army, Adolf Hitler. Then 25 years old, will remain marked by the hell he experienced in Flanders. In his book, Mein Kampf, Hitler writes, "The pride of the fighting soon turned into nightmare." For 4 years, the British refused to abandon the area around the Belgian town of Ypres. This small strip of Belgium must remain in Allied hands. That is the wish of the Belgian King Albert I, to whom King George V pays a visit of support. A Belgian military doctor, Major Max de Ville, says, "Holding our position is God's command, even if death awaits us all." Ypres, the last British stronghold in the north. This small town will become the tomb of thousands of Canadians in the Battle of Passchendaele. To fill the ranks, in the south of England, the British train ever more fighting men. Canadians, English and French-speaking, all volunteers, all wearing the same uniform, and all subjects of His Majesty. With his piercing blue eyes, King George V inspects the troops. They are the same age as his oldest son, who is serving in the Royal Navy. This worries the King and Queen Mary, seen here smiling bravely for the occasion. Claudius Corneliu, a private from Quebec, writes, "Our soldiers anticipate long hardship without questioning, without even grasping that on each face they will witness pain and anguish. They will suddenly be transported into the darkness of great calamity." After disembarking in the ports of France, the Canadians marched to the front, eager for battle. But little do they know that the war that they have trained for is over. A new tactic has emerged, one that will change the course of the war. In October, the Germans, determined to hold on to the regions they have conquered, begin to dig, or force civilians to dig for them, a network of fortifications in the oozing clay of Flanders. The heavy soil is waterlogged because the Belgians deliberately opened their dikes to flood the region. They work hard to make these trenches livable. But winter will push them to the limits of their endurance. Across from them, the British dig in too. They prepare to hold the front in Flanders, which is now at a stalemate. A war of movement is replaced by a war of position. The French High Command refuses to condone the troops installing themselves in trenches organized for defense. The soldiers know that their officers think only of attack. The Germans must be driven out of the French provinces they occupy, behind what is now a line of trenches 435 miles long that stretches from the North Sea to the Swiss border. In the winter of 1914, General Joffre launches vast offensives that are stopped dead by German machine guns. These offensives were meant to take pressure off the Russian front, but leave 100,000 men dead or wounded. On All Saints' Day, Pope Benedict XV addresses the world. He says, "This war is the suicide of Europe. There appears no limit to the destruction and carnage. Day after day, fresh blood is spilled on the earth. In view of this senseless crime, I repeat unto you, peace on earth to men of good will." There are moments of spontaneous fraternization on the front, as these rare images show. All these men risked being shot for treason. No one knows what became of them, and their celebrations were quickly stifled. the generals remain deaf and blind. The military, already very powerful at the beginning of the war, is starting to dominate politics and politicians. Despite the hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, the conflict spreads. In Africa, the French, British and Belgians attack the German colonies of Togo, Cameroon, Tanganyika, Rwanda and Namibia. Their goal: enlarge their colonial empires and obtain the raw materials needed for the war industry. Many of the native inhabitants in the European colonies of Africa were forced into conscription, as they were here in the German colony of Zanzibar. Others are lured by the soldiers' proud uniform and good pay. These troops will fight with loyalty and courage in the unspeakable conditions that all combatants face. A 100,000 Africans and 30,000 Europeans will lose their lives in Africa, victims of ferocious fighting and diseases such as dysentery, typhoid, and especially malaria. In Asia, to honor its treaty of alliance with Great Britain, Japan has fought the war against Germany from the beginning. The Japanese take the opportunity to help themselves to the German enclave in China, the port of Tsingtao. Japan, on the rise economically and militarily, demonstrates its superiority by shelling for 7 straight days the German defenses, which collapse. Tsingtao now in their hands, the Japanese turn their attention to the rest of China. While in Europe, the fighting bogs down, the conflict spreads to the Middle East. On the 23rd of November 1914 in Jerusalem, then part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire allied with Germany, the Muezzins call for a holy war to rally Muslim combatants against the French, British and Russians. The Ottoman Empire occupies a strategic position. Its capital, Constantinople, now Istanbul in Turkey, is the home of the Hagia Sophia Basilica, which has been turned into a mosque. Constantinople commands the passage between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The Ottoman Empire reaches as far as the Persian Gulf and threatens the Suez Canal, a vital artery for the British, and a major shipping route for supplies to the Western Front. The Ottoman sovereign is Sultan Mehmed V, here seen receiving the German monarch, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm II is worried about diplomatic maneuvering by the British, who tried to buy Turkey's allegiance, but the Germans outbid them. The Sultan is a ruler in name only. Power lies with a nationalist organization, the Young Turks. Its leader, Enver Pasha, is the country's real ruler. Educated in Germany, Enver Pasha leads an army of 1 million men, trained and supervised by Germans. The Germans are counting on Enver Pasha's armies to provide relief in the fight against Russia. Enver Pasha decides to attack Russia, Turkey's hereditary enemy, In the Caucasus, the border region inhabited by Muslims, the Ottomans hope these Muslims will rise up against the Tsar if a holy war is declared. The Turks, fearsome warriors, have already fought the Russians, who hold the passes, and who have deployed their troops in the mountains to draw the enemy toward the summits. During a previous war against the Turks, a Russian general said, "The Caucasus is a fortress, and only a madman would attempt to scale it." On the 22nd of December 1914, in the middle of winter, Enver Pasha launches an attack in the mountains near Sarakamish. The attack fails. Defeated, the 70,000 soldiers of the Turkish Third Army die of the cold, or are finished off as they retreat. Not a single Muslim, either in Russia or among its allies, rose up for the Holy War. The party in power, the Young Turks, and Enver Pasha, need a scapegoat. They settle on Turkey's Armenian community, who are Christians. The Turkish Interior Minister issues an order for genocide. The government has decided to destroy all the Armenians living in Turkey. No regard must be paid to either age or sex. No allowances will be made. The Turks hang the intellectuals and community leaders and appropriate their possessions. Their wives and daughters are raped, then murdered. The Armenians who survived the first massacres are herded by the Turks to camps in the Syrian desert, hundreds of miles away. Exhausted, beaten, denied food and water, they die along the way. Over 1 million Armenians are killed. For the Turks, the war goes on. On the 15th of March 1915, a joint British and French fleet tries to attack the Dardanelles Strait to take Constantinople and prevent Bulgaria from entering the war alongside the German and Ottoman empires. The Turks have powerful cannons and underwater minefields. They sink 3 battleships and damage 7 others. Out of a fleet of 18, 10 British and French warships are out of action. After the defeat, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty and mastermind of the mission, is forced to step down. But those responsible for the disaster are the admirals and generals. In their continued contempt and underestimation of the Turks, 1 month later, they attempt a landing on the coast of Turkey at Gallipoli to seize the enemy batteries. On the 25th of April 1915, the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand forces, together with British and French contingents, are dropped on the narrow beaches. From high on the steep slopes, the Turks fire on them with impunity. The Turks are well armed, well equipped, and well commanded by officers such as Mustafa Kemal, the future leader and modernizer of Turkey. Pinned down, the Allied troops endure months of agony. Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, the British war correspondent for the London Daily Telegraph, writes, "It is the most ghastly military fiasco in our history. The generals had no maps and only a vague idea of the nature of the ground in their front, and no adequate steps were taken to keep the troops supplied. The Australian volunteers have nothing to drink under a beating sun. Three months later, using his own camera, Ashmead Bartlett films these same men, now starving and feverish. They know that 150,000 men have been killed or wounded here in vain. Bulgaria has swung over to the German side. The Dardanelles remain in Turkish hands. The Daily Telegraph's correspondent directly addresses Herbert Asquith, the British Prime Minister, causing a scandal. "Mr. Prime Minister, I'm not sure you are aware of the true state of affairs out here, or to what extent the generals keep you informed. Here in Gallipoli, we are dissipating a large portion of the Empire's fortune and have not yet gained a single acre of ground of any strategic value. This futile expedition may ruin our prospects of wearing down Germany's colossal military power." Germany's power, embodied by the victor of East Prussia, Marshal von Hindenburg, nonetheless has its limits. The toll of German dead and wounded is turning public opinion against the war. In April, in The Hague, in the Netherlands, which remained neutral, the Women's Congress for Peace demands an immediate end to hostilities. But just the opposite happens, and instead of peace, the conflict expands again. The 23rd of May 1915, after 9 months of war that has claimed the lives of countless people. The citizens of Italy cheer as their nation joins the conflict. A neutral power in the early months of the war, it was nonetheless allied with Germany. Britain and France promised to return to Italy the cities of Trento and Trieste, which are still in Austrian territory. Italy changes sides. A patriotic anti-Austrian fever sweeps Italy, fed by the grandiloquent verses of the nationalist poet Gabriel D'Annunzio. "You are the raging sparks of the sacred blaze. May all voices be a single flaming cry, Italia, Italia." These young Italians have no idea of the hardships ahead as they march into the Alpine War. In France, the front is deadlocked in the trenches, though punctuated by attacks as deadly as they are futile. Private Charles Gillard writes, "Here, morale is very poor. We're fed up with fighting but not advancing, and the peasants envy their cows, which are bedded more comfortably than they are." The enemy is on the other side of a sea of barbed wire which stretches to infinity. Given the impasse, the Germans decide to strike a major blow in the east, in the part of Poland still under Russian rule. Certain of his success, the new German commander-in-chief, General von Falkenhayn, authorizes American journalist Wilbur Durbrow and his crew to follow the German army for 6 months. They travel in an American luxury convertible, a Stutz, led by a German military guide. Durbrow is clearly proud of his scoop. In the United States, which is still officially neutral, hostility toward Germany surges after a German submarine torpedoes and sinks the British liner SS Lusitania on the 7th of May, 1915, killing 1,500, including 120 Americans. The Germans claim the attack is justified because the Lusitania was transporting ammunition. Proof of this emerges only years later. But the darkening mood at home does not stop Durbrow from enjoying his travels with these German officers. He presents an affectionate portrait of the Kaiser's troops, relaxing before the attack. After the German victory in Poland, Durbrow films thousands of Russian prisoners. And in this shot of a captured Russian field kitchen, he shows Germans who seem to like Russian food. Durbrow films himself on the platform at the Warsaw train station, alongside German soldiers celebrating the city's capture. Then, accompanied by a police contingent armed with whips, he films the Jews in the Jewish quarter. And the German army's victory march into Warsaw on the 4th of August, 1915. Other war cameramen also capture images of Germany's might. As Zeppelins bomb London, the British realize that the heart of their empire is now vulnerable. A new kind of warfare is born. Industrial warfare. A war of destruction, of annihilation. The aim now is to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. Assembly lines turn out a flood of even deadlier inventions. Grenades of all kinds. Bombshells of every caliber. A variety of poison gases. A proud achievement of scientific research. The men slowly begin to realize that the old ways of combat are dead. Science and industry have transformed war into a new type of living hell. A hell that will claim the lives of millions. The front line, 1915. All hopes of a quick war have been abandoned. For 15 months, the conflict has engulfed Europe, drawing in nearly every major superpower and costing countless lives. Trench warfare has caused a stalemate where neither side can move. But still, the constant shelling and pointless assaults on enemy positions continue. With losses so high, neither side wants to surrender. Life in these conditions is a living hell. Death and disease are everywhere, and the men have no choice but to live amongst the rats. In the trenches, every day is the same. Despite repeated attacks, neither side gains any ground. When the whistle blows, men go over the top. Very few ever return. The constant shelling wreaks devastation. Most terrifying of all is shrapnel, shells filled with lead pellets and gunpowder that explode in mid-air. The writer Maurice Genevois describes it. I'm caught in a hail of shrapnel. The lead shot riddles the ground around me, pierces mess kits, and splits men's skulls. Doctors encounter horrific wounds never seen before. They can do nothing for the trauma caused by the shelling. Fits of terror, trembling, paralysis. Millions of men find themselves caught in the deadly trap of this massive war. September 1915. In the east, the Turks, the Austrians, and the Germans battle the Russians. In the south, the Austrians hold the Italians in check. In the west, the Germans face the Belgians, French, and British along a line of trenches that stretches 400 miles. To hold their positions, the Allied troops need better protection. So in September 1915, French factories, now staffed by women, convert to war work with a rush order for 20 million helmets. These are complicated to produce, but are designed to offer protection from shrapnel. A film features one of these factory workers leaving a note in a helmet in order to boost the morale of its wearer. Dear soldier, I am a simple Frenchwoman wishing you a quick and happy return to your loved ones. May this helmet bring you luck. Lucy Lambert. This lucky soldier and his companions also sport new uniforms. The color, dubbed Horizon Blue, is supposed to blend in with the sky during assaults. But the men worry that this new kit is a sign of a drawn-out war. Like the French, the British adopt a metal helmet. A Canadian, Private Corneliu, complains it is too heavy. It weighs over 2 pounds, but it is sturdier than the French helmet, and with its shallow shape can be made from a single sheet of steel. Still, they're outclassed by their enemies, with the famous Stahlhelm, or steel helmet, which comes to symbolize the German soldier. Its wider shape, covering more of the head, is better suited to this new form of warfare. In Storm of Steel, Lieutenant Ernst Junger writes, "It's an easier matter to describe these sounds than to endure them, because one cannot but associate every single sound of flying steel with the idea of death. This artillery warfare requires that the troops hold their ground beneath every barrage. But the feared shrapnel shells would soon be replaced by an even deadlier weapon." By September 1915, nearly all the superpowers of Europe are in the war. To cope with the new tactic of trench warfare, each side develops deadlier and deadlier weapons. But nothing was more feared than the clouds of poison gas. Though first deployed by the French, it was the Germans who perfected chemical weapons, using them to kill thousands at the Battle of Ypres in Belgium. Soon, the race is on to discover the most lethal formula. A military doctor, Major Fleur, writes, "Men turn purple. They cry for air and complain of burning in the chest and stomach. We have seen it all, ghastly wounds and deadly avalanches of steel. But they are nothing compared to the fog that darkened the sun in the sky for hours, which seemed like centuries." In addition to helmets, soldiers are issued gas masks as protection against this new form of warfare. The French army perfects its protective measures. Cotton for the respiratory tract, and a cloth on which the soldier is to urinate. This is supposed to help protect against chlorine. Found to be ineffective, this approach is replaced by goggles and a thick pad soaked with a protective chemical. Like the hoods used by the British, which make it almost impossible to breathe, they are soon abandoned. Finding a German corpse, the French learn just how much more advanced their enemies are in this technology. By autumn 1915, the Germans are using the Gummi mask, a rubber mask with a filter of activated charcoal. It will soon be copied by every army and remain in service until the end of the war. Combatants on all sides now live in constant terror of poison gas, obsessed with the smell. As one German artillery officer puts it, "The men sniff about like hunting dogs." But once protected, they can hold their ground. The front line doesn't budge. The Germans occupy almost all of Belgium and 10 French provinces, including the cities of Lille, Cambrai, and Saint-Quentin. German troops are better supplied than their families back in Brandenburg and Saxony. They take over the livestock the peasants left behind when they fled the combat zone, and their rabbit hutches and stores of cheese. The finest residences are reserved for the military brass, far from the realities of the front. Among all the belligerents, the class system is upheld. The lords inhabit the chateaux, while the peasants, underlings, and servants huddle in foxholes. On the French side, excavators tear up the countryside, digging even more trenches, which are now organized in 3 successive lines. The first line of trenches is the most dangerous, the deadliest of all. Human ingenuity knows no bounds when it comes to killing. Anything can be used to launch explosives at the enemy in the opposite trench. Grenade launching rifles, flying torpedoes, even medieval crossbows are put to use. Then there is the giant slingshot used by British soldiers, as well as their plum pudding, a strange projectile that is almost as dangerous for its gunners as for the enemy. Between artillery barrages, the soldiers wait. They sleep. They play cards, write letters, and stave off boredom by cobbling together all sorts of objects out of copper cartridges. They construct makeshift shelters and give them suggestive names, like this one meaning home, miserable home. The stench is overpowering. Private Albert Thierry writes, "No one washes or combs their hair. I've never worn the same clothes for so long." At night, the soldiers descend into their underground shelters. One man even builds a cage to protect himself from rats. Sergeant Beck writes, "One of my men was bitten on the ear, another on the nose. When we're lying down, rats scamper over us like cats. They devour everything we have, chocolate, camembert cheese, even our rifle stocks. The men hunt them any way they can. In just one hole, they killed 17 of them, like small rabbits. The rats carry fleas and scabies. Lice are a scourge in all the trenches." But for soldiers on the front line, the appalling hygienic conditions and the serious diseases they engender are nothing compared to the terror of going over the top. And they have to stay at least a week at the front before being relieved by troops from the second line, the support line. After an attack, first-line survivors carry the wounded through narrow ditches to reach the third line, the reserve line, located among the abandoned towns. They need time to catch their breath. Lance Corporal Tanti writes, "We read the letters of Hun prisoners. They are the same as ours. Misery, despair, the monstrous stupidity of all these things. Those wretches, the Huns, are the same as us. They are like us, and for all of us, the hardship is the same." The reserve line allows the French soldiers, known as poilus, or hairy beasts, to wash and feel human again. October 1915. In the West, it's a stalemate. In the Balkans, the Germans, Austrians, and Bulgarians who have entered the conflict overrun Serbia in 1 month. The French and the British open a new front in Salonika to assist the Serbs and to bring Greece into the war on their side. On the morning of the 12th of October 1915, Sergeant Potard, aboard a French cargo ship, writes, "Having come from the Alsatian front, still red with the blood of our comrades, we arrive at what had been described to us as an unknown destination. Salonika comes into view, a simply marvelous sight. Bathed in the golden light of the Orient, the city spreads out before me, bleached white, with its minarets on mosques and domes on churches. Imagine my stupefaction when I land. The dock is crowded with people of every race and every language. All one sees are faces ravaged by jaundice and smallpox. disease will decimate the 500,000 men concentrated around Salonika, a 100-square-mile enclave on Greek territory, protected by a ring of artillery. What is known as the Army of the Orient is an amalgam of British, French, Serbs, Montenegrins, Italians, Russians, and Annamese or Tonkinese from French Indochina. They will be dragged into a series of ambushes against the Bulgarians, who prove more combative than expected. Temperatures hit 40 degrees in the shade, and the swamps teem with flies and mosquitoes, leading to 6,000 deaths from malaria alone. In London, King George V is concerned about his government's talk of withdrawing from Salonika, and about the fate of his troops on all fronts. He writes, "I shall follow your every movement with deepest interest. Indeed, your welfare will never be absent from my thoughts." King George and every other head of state should be seeking a way to halt the massacre. After 16 months of war, 5 million men are already dead, but no one wants to stop. Even most of the widows call for vengeance, and the leaders judge the human and material costs to be so high that the enemy must be made to pay. And so the war goes on. On the 6th of December 1915, the military and political leaders of France, Great Britain, Belgium, Russia, and Italy convene in Chantilly near Paris. They agree to improve the coordination of their armies, to stop depleting their resources in separate attacks, and to organize a united Anglo-French offensive for the summer of 1916. The offensive will originate from the British and French positions on the Somme River. But the Germans beat them to it by launching their own offensive in Verdun. Verdun is a gateway city on the Meuse River, but the French consider it to be a quiet sector. They have dismantled the cannons of its forts and sent them to the hotspots on the front. The garrison has been reduced to a minimum. Yet the Germans are only 12 miles away. In early February 1916, the Germans begin massing troops and artillery for what they hope will be a decisive battle. German cameramen arrive to film Kaiser Wilhelm II, who has come to encourage his son and heir, the Crown Prince, who leads a force of 150,000 men. Their plan: either capture Verdun and open the road to Paris, or, if the French army digs in, the Germans decimate it. In early February 1916, under the command of Crown Prince Wilhelm, the heir to the throne, the German army begins amassing a force of 150,000 men for an assault on Verdun, a quiet gateway city on the Meuse River. On the morning of the 21st of February 1916, the Crown Prince launches Operation Gericht, or Judgment. Within hours, 1 million shells have pummeled the French positions. "95 miles away, troops in the Vosges can hear the bombardment. For their attack on Verdun, the Germans deploy a terrifying weapon, the flamethrower. They break through the French lines and enter the Cour forest, where the trees have been blasted by shells. Here, the Germans encounter unexpected resistance from the French soldiers who survived the barrage. The surviving French forces managed to slow down the German attack, but the Crown Prince remains confident and congratulates his stormtroopers. Shaken, the French decide to defend Verdun to the end. A new commander is named, General Philippe Pétain, who's remained on the sidelines. The general is known to oppose the French strategy of offense at all costs, and he implements a defensive strategy. His orders are to dig in and hold on. The French stop the German advance. The battlefield becomes a slaughterhouse. Verdun survivor and winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Jean Giono, later writes, "We are 9 in a hole. Nothing will get us out of here. But we have eaten. We must relieve ourselves." The first of us to feel the urge climbs out. He has been there for 2 days now, 10 feet away, killed with his trousers down. We go on paper and throw it up and out. When we have no more paper, we go in our haversacks. The Battle of Verdun continues. We go in our hands. Dysentery flows between our fingers. We pass blood. We go where we lie. We are devoured by flames of thirst. We drink our own urine. If we remain in this battlefield, it is because they won't let us get away. Two second lieutenants, Herdouin and Milan, are executed for desertion. They had retreated after the Germans had smashed through the French lines. With so many killed, there is insufficient manpower. High Command institutes a rotation system so that nearly every regiment of the French army is forced through this hell. This torrent of men is backed by a massive industrial effort. A fleet of 12,000 trucks and a special railway transport the 2,000 tons of munitions required each day to defend Verdun. The French and Germans each fire 300,000 shells a day. 20 million shells during the entire battle. The millions of soldiers also need to be fed. The generals think that the men need to eat lots of meat. Troops get far more than civilians behind the lines. The army's butchers slaughter the horses wounded in combat. In the Battle of Verdun, 7,000 horses die in a single day. It takes enormous effort to transport the food to the front lines, and a great deal of courage. Marksmen on both sides target the supply convoys. The trenches lack water. Private Potacher writes, "We're dying of thirst, but I drink more hooch in one day here than I have in my entire life." Hooch, or rum, keeps the men going before an assault. To cope with the horrors of daily life, there is an endless supply of rough wine, or plonk. Private Ork writes, "A glass of plonk too many, and they break into song to dispel the gloom that gnaws at them like some invisible animal."
Madelon vient nous servir à boire. Sous la tonnelle, on frôle son jupon et chacun lui raconte une histoire à sa façon. La Madelon pour nous n'est pas ses frères.
The Germans too need comfort. They find it in schnapps, in camaraderie, in religion. Their experience mirrors that of their adversaries. Corporal Karl Fritz of the 10th Mountain Battalion writes, "We spent 3 days lying in shell holes, looking death in the eye, expecting it at any moment. One shell buries the dead. The next one uncovers them again. In Verdun, in this cold month of March 1916, only the aviators escape the trenches. The Kaiser's pilots are lords of the skies. They see themselves as modern-day knights. One of them is Hermann Goering. He is 23 years old. Aggressive and ambitious, he amasses aerial victories and develops the heart of a merciless killer. But in reality, pilots face every bit as much danger as foot soldiers. Rarely strapped in, with no parachutes, German aviators fly over the French lines of Verdun to photograph enemy positions. Or if possible, drop bombs on them. That is, if they can evade French fighter aircraft. The Germans also shoot down the balloons of artillery spotters. It takes a lot of courage to go up in them, but it is vital work. Linked to the ground by telephone, the officers direct artillery fire. Protecting them becomes a priority, as General Petain affirms with his order, "Sweep the Germans from the sky." With the development of ACACs, or anti-aircraft guns, the appearance of new and faster airplanes, and the arrival of squadrons of fearless and implacable young pilots, in just 3 months' time, France regains the upper hand in the skies over Verdun. After 5 aerial victories, fighter pilots earn the title of Ace. They become famous, like Second Lieutenant George Guynemer, the 21-year-old who had been rejected by the army in 1914 as too scrawny. Now, promoted flag bearer for the public, he is a national hero, decorated with the Legion of Honor, a model of devotion to his country. The war in the sky is every bit as brutal as the war in the trenches, and more often than not, ends in the same mud. April 1916 sees the spring thaw. The Verdun soil, torn up by shelling, turns into an impassable swamp. But the army wants to project an image of determination. After a French counterattack that advances the front a few short yards, a cameraman films an infantryman who is laying new barbed wire. In no man's land, the deadly expanse between the opposing trenches, the enemy returns the very same night to cut down the barbed wire. In Verdun, for 300 days and 300 nights, the Germans attack, and the Allies hold on. Yet there are touching stories. When his entire company is gassed, Corporal Pierre Weber, whose lungs are burned, is carried out by his less severely wounded comrades. In a large hospital far from the front, Pierre is cared for by a nurse, Charlotte. They fall in love. He is granted permission to recover in Le Tang-la-Ville, outside Paris, and he brings Charlotte with him. Here they are, in the rose garden of his sister, Jacqueline, who is married to a pioneer of home movies, René Ferrari. At 40, too old to fight, René is assigned to the medical service and is allowed to sleep at home. Many such men serve on the home front, posted to factories or offices. Soldiers on leave view them with envy and bitterness. Charlotte, like thousands of women, devotes herself to her handsome military invalid. But she doesn't have many choices. Already there are few men left. Women don't want to be old maids, an even worse fate than being a young widow. In England, it is now common to marry in haste before the groom returns to the front. She will receive his pay after his death. Everyone senses that the worst is yet to come. Across the British Empire, a vast recruiting campaign enlists 500,000 more men. Fathers and sons, cousins, neighbors, often enlist together. But these patriotic volunteers cannot meet the ravenous needs of the major offensives. Voluntary enlistment is eventually replaced by conscription. For French President Raymond Poincaré and the British King George V, the Somme offensive, decided upon at the Conference of December 1915, will break the German lines and open the road to Berlin. However, French Commander-in-Chief General Joffre now argues in favor of relieving the French forces, still entrenched at Verdun. The fighting there has inflicted enormous losses, 40,000 dead in 6 months. General Foch of France and General Haig of Britain will have the honor of commanding this huge offensive aimed at putting an end to the war, and they proudly display their full confidence. The British are massed to the north of the town of Albert, and the French to the south. Their goal is to march on the occupied towns of Peronne and Bapaume, penetrating the German trenches along a 30-mile-long front. The plan is familiar by now. Crush the Germans with artillery fire before sending in the troops. The size of the force is staggering. 40 divisions, almost 600,000 men, and 4,000 pieces of artillery. Lieutenant John Buchan writes, "Troops were everywhere on the move, and the shifting of ammunition dumps nearer to the firing line foretold what was coming. There was a curious exhilaration everywhere. For the soldiers, the great offensive had finally come." July 1916. The British and French armies prepare for the Somme offensive, a coordinated attack on two fronts designed to break the German lines and open up the road to Berlin. It is a massive undertaking, needing 4,000 pieces of artillery and almost 600,000 men. But these young recruits, smiling at the camera, have received minimal training. This will be their first battle. The British are also counting on underground explosives to destroy the German front line. Since the introduction of trenches, each side has tried to tunnel under the enemy and blow them up. Everyone listens for sounds coming from underground, which can mean either that the enemy is burrowing towards you or that you're closing in on his trench. This time, British sappers have dug a tunnel nearly a mile long beneath the German trenches, filling it with 24 tons of powerful explosive. The 1st of July 1916, 7:20 a.m. The mine is blown up, leaving a crater 300 feet across. But the Germans had heard the sappers and withdrawn. The most powerful underground mine of the war left no victims. "20 other mines are also blown up. 7:30 a.m. The British artillery, which had been shelling the German lines for 8 days, hold their fire, opening the way for an assault. But the shelling hasn't cleared the barbed wire or destroyed the concrete bunkers. The Germans come out, stunned but alive. For 10 minutes, nothing happens. The Germans have time to set up their machine guns. 20 minutes after the first explosion, the British prepare to attack. All these young, inexperienced men are afraid. To reassure them, Captain Billy Neville is the first man over, dribbling a football across no man's land. Until he is killed by German machine gun fire. By the end of this hellish day, the British have suffered 20,000 dead. "40,000 troops are wounded. They will have to endure a long and excruciating journey to the hospital. Most of the time, this delay means gangrene, amputation, or death. Survivors report that the shelling destroyed nothing. This doesn't stop General Hayek from ordering further suicidal attacks. In Paris, in the Élysée Palace, the President of the French Republic, Raymond Poincaré, writes in his diary, Saturday, 1st of July 1916. Blood is flowing like water north of the Somme. Meanwhile, sunlight dapples the trees of the Élysée. Elms, sycamores, chestnut trees, acacias radiate greens of every hue in delicious harmony. Blackbirds, wood pigeons, and smaller birds frolic on the lawn. Over there, in Verdun and the Somme, thousands of brave young men are dying. In September, at the Somme, the British unveil a new weapon, capable of piercing the barbed wire and opening the way for the infantry. To mislead enemy spies, they refer to these armored assault vehicles as tanks. At first, the Germans are terrified, but slow and vulnerable and deployed in too small numbers, The early models prove easy targets for enemy artillery. And day after day, the carnage continues. The troops at the Somme begin to question their leaders' strategies. By the end of the battle, 50,000 Frenchmen die. 130,000 British Empire troops also fall, as well as 160,000 Germans. On the 18th of November 1916, the French and British announced the end of the bloody Battle of the Somme, which has lasted 5 months. They have advanced only 10 miles and reoccupied some German trenches, where they have taken prisoners, either exhausted or deaf from the shelling. Here, in Courcelette, the German prisoners and their captors, French Canadians of the Vendoux, briefly put the war behind them. A German doctor, George Batlin, of the 26th Infantry Division writes, "It is inconceivable that this horrible fighting can continue much longer. In the end, there will be no one left. But how can there be peace when we are intent on mowing down a whole generation in the flower of its youth?" In the spring of the following year, after the disastrous offensive known as the Chemin des Dames, French troops by the thousands will refuse to move up to the front line, which they know is a direct route to a mass grave. In the prison-like universe of the trenches, the men smoke non-stop to mask the odor of rotting flesh. And they vent their despair with the song, Chanson de Craon, named after the village where hundreds of their fellow soldiers were killed. Farewell to life, farewell to love, farewell to all the women. It's all over now. We're done for good with this awful war. It's in Craon, up on the hill, that we must meet our Maker, because we are all sentenced to die. We have been sacrificed. On the 15th of June 1917, at the court-martial of the 17th Division, one of the French mutineers is found guilty of having said, "We need to end the war, not through victory, but through revolution." Revolution, which has already broken out in Russia in February 1917. The Russian soldiers have also mutinied. The Tsar has been driven out. Many Russians had hoped that the revolution would bring an end to the war, but they soon realized that the conflict has grown too big to be controlled by a single nation. And so the Great War continues. (1917). For 3 years, the citizens of Europe have been living in hell. The war, that was only meant to last a few weeks, has spiraled out of control. The colossal effort involved in continuing the conflict has drained the resources of every country involved, and now millions are starving to death. But despite the countless lives lost and the scale of the destruction, the Great War shows no sign of ending. excerpt from a German propaganda film. The ogre of tuberculosis stalks Germany's children. Food rations are lowered to 1,000 calories a day. Over the course of the war, 400,000 German civilians will die of malnutrition. Victor Klemperer, later a celebrated intellectual, survives this ordeal. He writes, "I never used to be obsessed with food. Now I go to bed and wake up famished, weary, my imagination exhausted. And again I think, if only I had more potatoes." The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, continues to enjoy lavish meals. He and his entourage could hardly be too concerned about the fate of civilians when, by 1917, 1 million German soldiers have already been killed on the various fronts. After 3 years of war in the trenches, the men are filled with rage and desperate to see it end. In 1917, the Germans are on the defensive in the west. They are determined to hold their conquered territory in northern France and Belgium. In the east, Germany occupies 310,000 square miles of the Russian Empire. Russia, February 1917. Tsar Nicholas II is still in the field commanding the army. In the capital, the Tsarina governs in his stead. The Russian people hate her, convinced she is a German spy. The evil monk Rasputin is dead, assassinated because of his influence over the Tsarina. In this climate of madness and heightened religious fervor, the Tsar must face a tragedy, the death toll. 1.5 million Russian soldiers are dead. Close to 5 million have been wounded. A factory for artificial limbs in Kiev is meant to reassure the country's many amputees. Instead, it symbolizes a broken regime. The war has amputated Russia's wealth and vitality, its lifeblood. The Russian army begins to mutiny. Many soldiers abandon their posts to join their wives, who on the 23rd of February 1917, in St. Petersburg, demonstrate against the war, famine, and the loss of their husbands. They are joined by students and workers. It is the start of the Russian Revolution. In the Russian capital, the army garrison responsible for maintaining civilian order sides with the rebels. The banners proclaim, "The people and the army united. Peace. Long live the Republic. And down with the old regime." On the 15th of March 1917, Nicholas II abdicates. He is captured here on film for the last time, with his 4 daughters, the Grand Duchesses, and his only son and heir, Tsarevich Alexei, a hemophiliac too fragile to reign. Nicholas is looking for another successor. But unrest has reached such a pitch that the Soviet, the Revolutionary Council in the capital, demands an end to the Romanov dynasty, which has plunged Russia into the war. A provisional, moderate government, dominated by the Minister of Justice, the socialist Alexander Kerensky, considers allowing the deposed Tsar to go into exile. Nicholas, under house arrest, requests political asylum from his dear cousin, King George V. While awaiting the answer, the Tsar writes in his diary, "Today I sorted through my books and belongings, choosing what I will take to England." The family's departure is delayed because the children have come down with measles. Much to their amusement, the Tsarina has their heads shaved. But precious time has been lost. In England, King George does not want to endanger his own popularity or his throne. Fear of revolutionary contagion haunts the British government. It formally advises against providing refuge to the Tsar and his family. George V abandons his dear cousin, who so closely resembles him. The great empires begin to fall. The people of Russia hope that the recent revolution, removing Tsar Nicholas II from power, will finally put an end to the terrible war that has claimed so many Russian lives. But Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, needs the help of his French and British allies to retain power. So, like the Tsar before him, he begins to fan the flames of patriotism. Kerensky plans an offensive. He counts on a victory to unite the Russian people around his democratic and republican regime. Germany's ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is also teetering. Its peoples are starving because of the British naval blockade. At the end of the previous year, Vienna had buried its emperor, Franz Joseph, who died at the age of 86 after reigning for over half a century. He lived long enough to witness the disaster he helped unleash after the assassination in Sarajevo in 1914. His generals had pushed the emperor into war. Now, half their army is gone. In his book, The World of Yesterday, Stefan Zweig captures the prevailing pessimism. He writes, "The steps of the Temple of Peace are awash in blood." It's a heavy legacy for the new emperor, Karl I. At 29, Karl is keenly aware of the fragility of his empire after its defeats, and the demands for independence by his peoples, like the Czechs, Slovaks, and Yugoslavs. Karl has served at the front. He hates war. He opposes the tactic of futile assaults with their terrible cost in human life. He and his young wife, Zita, are devout Catholics. What he wants above all is to make peace. He fears the revolutionary flames spreading from Russia. He says, "The waves of revolutionary unrest will sweep everything away. If we monarchs do not make peace, the people will make it over our heads." In March 1917, he sends a secret peace proposal to Paris that interests France and England. But Karl refuses to grant concessions to Italy, and negotiations fail. In Germany, when Kaiser Wilhelm II is informed of this separate peace plan, he threatens to invade his ally, Austria. The Kaiser makes his own proposal to end the hostilities. He suggests that the belligerents accept the status quo. Germany will keep the territory it has conquered, Belgium, northern France, and of course, Alsace-Lorraine. France categorically rejects Germany's peace proposal. This only hardens the position of the German military, headed by Field Marshal von Hindenburg. And from this point on, in full command, the true master of Germany, General Ludendorff. In Berlin, Ludendorff is worried about strikes and social unrest that echo the events in Russia. The munitions factories have been kept running for the last 3 years by exhausted women and soldiers no longer able to serve at the front. The famous Bergfrieden, the sacred union between socialists and government authorities that had made the war possible, begins to break down. Key German socialist leaders abandon the party to found the Spartacus Revolutionary Movement, which calls for an immediate end to the war. Ludendorff sees but one solution: a German victory as quickly as possible. Bring England to its knees with what he calls unrestricted submarine warfare. This decision will change the course of history. 100 German submarines are ordered to attack any and all commercial vessels, including neutral ships, contrary to international laws of the sea. The German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, fears an American reaction. He says, Germany is lost. The Unterseeboot, or U-boats, received the order to fire their torpedoes at any ship supplying England, including American ones. The German admirals calculate that if their submarines sink 500,000 tons of ships a month, England will surrender in 6 months. Whereas if the Americans enter the war, they will not be ready for a year. The First Battle of the Atlantic begins. These submarine commanders are the new heroes of Germany. Among them is this descendant of French immigrants, now a model Prussian, Lothar van Arnold de la Perrière. His submarine, U-35, stars in a propaganda film glorifying his accomplishments. He proudly takes the famous Lloyd's Register of Ships, published by the British Insurance Company, and listing every commercial vessel in the world, and crosses out his latest kill. De la Perrière will sink 200 ships, over 500,000 tons, a record. Crews aboard the merchant ships have no chance against the U-boats lurking below the surface. And the 1,700 French soldiers aboard the transport ship Gallia had no chance against de la Perrière, who sank their ship without mercy. The unrestricted submarine war confirms the German Chancellor's worst fears. On the 19th of March 1917, 3 American merchant ships are sunk in the Atlantic. This event allows US President Woodrow Wilson to act. He needs an excuse to bring America into the war. Wilson can no longer remain a pacifist. For him, France is the birthplace of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. If France is threatened, so is democracy. He declares, America is privileged to spend her blood for the principles that gave her birth and happiness. and the peace which she has treasured. But it is not only on principle that he wishes to help the French and British. The two countries owe the United States $2 billion. This debt will never be repaid if Germany wins the war. But America has profited from its neutrality. After a long economic crisis, US manufacturing is flourishing thanks to the export to Europe of canned goods, cotton, ore, and explosives for the war industry. America has become powerful, and Wilson wanted to play a leading role in the world that will emerge from the war. However, in 1916, while campaigning for re-election, Wilson had promised the 6 million voters of German origin that America would remain neutral. The press is solidly isolationist and opposed to any US military intervention. Wilson must turn public opinion in favor of the war. In the wake of the torpedo attacks, another crisis erupts, providing ammunition for his stance. The previous year, the US cavalry had intervened in Mexico following acts of sabotage along the border. Wilson suspects that Mexico is being financed by Germany to create unrest in the US. His suspicions are confirmed when the British Secret Service intercepts a German telegram that promises Mexico nothing less than the states of Texas and Arizona if Germany wins the war. This telegram provides Wilson the pretext he needs to end American isolationism and to convince Congress to vote for war on Germany on the 6th of April, 1917. The United States enters the war against Germany and its allies. It joins ranks with the British Empire, which reaches from Canada to Australia, France and its colonies, Russia, Italy, Belgium, Serbia, Greece, Portugal, and Japan. On the 24th of April, France's Marshal Joffre visits the United States to promote the alliance. His presence awakens in many Americans their passion for France. In 1781, the Marquis de Lafayette, a French aristocrat and military officer, had made a decisive contribution to the American War of Independence. Lafayette, nous voici, Lafayette, we are here, will soon become the battle cry of American troops. In France, there's already a Lafayette squadron made up of volunteer pilots. The French flag waves alongside the Stars and Stripes, the British Union Jack, and banners proclaiming, "Hell is too good for the Hun." Despite the early enthusiasm, the impassioned speeches in defense of democracy, the huge parades, and impressive demonstrations of military might, America has practically no army. Only 125,000 troops, including 15,000 of these Marines, its only real soldiers. There is an urgent need for volunteers. The Americans follow the lead of the British and issue a recruiting poster featuring Uncle Sam saying, "I want you." US authorities expect 1 million men to volunteer. But 6 weeks in, only 80,000 have signed up. For Americans, the war is far away. They are still haunted by the butchery of the Civil War, which ended just 50 years earlier. The Selective Service Act is imposed. At first, training of recruits is rudimentary. There is nothing ready except the dreaded drill sergeant. Not enough uniforms, dummy wood rifles, and dummy cannons too. On the other hand, the recruits are often good street fighters, a skill they've learned in a country whose evolution is marked by bloodshed. But soon, these men will be plunged into real warfare. After it is discovered that Germany plans to help Mexico invade America after it has won the war, the US President Woodrow Wilson finally has the evidence he needs to bring America into the conflict. With overwhelming support from Congress, on the 6th of April 1917, the United States of America declares war on Germany. But none of these soldiers will make it to Europe if German submarines continue sinking Allied vessels. A decision is made to arm the ships and to organize them in convoys protected by escorts of destroyers. The small destroyers are built for speed and maneuverability, with crews trained to spot the periscopes of lurking submarines. They are armed with depth charges, canisters filled with explosives that are dropped overboard. Set to explode at a certain depth, they can sink a submarine or force it to surface. German losses rise, and the convoy system enables more supplies to reach England and France. In the spring of 1917, France has been at war for 3 years. A disastrous offensive in the north has begun a crisis in the French army. French troops do not understand why their commanders have learned nothing from the suicidal assaults. General Pétain is now commander-in-chief. He is known to take the well-being of his troops to heart, unlike the other generals. The French Army Film Unit exploits his popularity. He is portrayed as a benevolent father figure in a scene aimed at quelling unrest among the troops. He drinks their rough wine, and after tasting their soup, orders that it be improved. And he hands out cigarettes, his solemn expression meant to convey what a great and determined leader he is. But the military tribunals have put 3,500 mutineers on trial. 1,380 have been sentenced to long prison terms. 600 have been condemned to death. 57 have been executed. In a letter confiscated by army mail censors, a French soldier writes, "If women knew how bad it is, they would rise up together to end the war. They would shout, 'We demand our husbands, down with war.'" Another intercepted letter from a soldier in the 36th Infantry Regiment says, "I protested like the others. I'm too weary of war. My dear sweet wife, take pity on my weakness. Forgive me, but I've had enough of war." Corporal Louis Barthas prefers to confide in his notebook. As I write, the Russian Revolution is breaking out. These Slavic soldiers, subject to iron discipline, who marched into the massacre like passive slaves, have broken their chains. But sympathizers beware. One subversive word, and it's a court-martial. No letter goes unopened. 10 billion letters are exchanged during the war. For many soldiers, these letters from home give them the will to live. The men know that their letters may be read by government censors. June 1917. Thousands of soldiers go on leave on orders from Pétain, as if he had agreed to one of the demands of the mutineers. In fact, he is only applying the law, ignored until then, that grants troops 7 days rest every 4 months. Thousands of men can suddenly go home. Like Private Gaston Lavie, already in his 40s, he fought at the Battle of Verdun. Back home in Paris, he is bitter. No one cares about us. We are being sacrificed, the poor fools at the front. We feel forgotten, unwanted, out of place, as if we don't belong. The war enriches the profiteers. Away from the front, the good life goes on. But the wave of mutinies dissolves in resignation, helplessness, and lack of coordination with other strikes and protests in factories back home. But the French army has no strength left for further offensives. The arrival of the first American troops brings a ray of hope. Having crossed the Atlantic, despite the threat of the German U-boats, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force is first to disembark. General John Pershing is fresh from his great success leading the Mexican military expedition. He lands at Boulogne on the 13th of June 1917. The French admire his fine military bearing and dashing appearance. Parisians welcome him with hope, born out of anguish. His first act is to pay his respects with Marshal Joffre at the tomb of Lafayette.
2,000 miles from home, an American army is fighting for you.
On the 23rd of June 1917, the mayor of Saint-Nazaire posts these notices. In a few hours, American troops will land in Saint-Nazaire. We owe them the friendliest of welcomes. Let us cheer our allies as they pass. Let us wave flags in their honor. The great American Republic and our own are fighting for the same ideal of civilization, justice, and honor. Long live the United States of America. Long live France. Soon, there will be 1 million US soldiers in France. At first, the Americans wear the campaign hat, but soon switch to the more effective British helmet. Corporal Charlie Bell from Boston, Massachusetts writes, "These people drink wine as if it was water." Too young to drink at home, the Americans quickly develop a taste for wine. In general, the US soldiers are popular wherever they go. The French, as well as the British, want to force Pershing to integrate American soldiers in French units. Pershing refuses. he insists on an American army. He says, no one ever puts new wine in old goat skins. As a concession to his allies, he assigns to the amalgamated units African American soldiers. The African American soldiers are stunned by the welcome they receive from the French troops. Back home, these grandchildren of slaves still live under the oppression of segregation. Their French commander, General Goybet, says, "We will never forget the heroism of our African American brothers in arms." But in the American army, African American soldiers are usually relegated to non-combat duties. They bring to the old world the new world's music. Jazz takes the continent by storm. Here, in a French military hospital, the celebrated Harlem jazz musician, James Reese Europe, entertains the wounded with his famous Memphis blues. The Americans' training is considered substandard by British and French instructors, who are brought in to raise their combat skills. It will take time to turn the Americans into real soldiers. They are also desperately short of equipment. America still cannot meet the needs of its troops. It has to buy from France 2,500 cannons, 11 million artillery shells, 50,000 machine guns, 200 million bullets, 4,500 airplanes, and above all, 235 Renault FTs. This revolutionary new tank, the first armored vehicle with a rotating turret, is crucial to the war of movement that Pershing wants to wage. To finance this staggering purchase, the United States launches a massive bond issue. The Little Tramp, played by Charlie Chaplin, then the world's most famous movie star, encourages audiences to buy Liberty bonds. The French too are now accustomed to constant requests to buy war bonds, as are citizens of all nations fighting to bring the Kaiser to his knees. Moviegoers are frequently targeted. In this famous scene, a decade before the talkies, a soldier addresses the audience directly, while behind the screen, a real actor speaks his lines. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have but one word to say to you. Subscribe." The war costs 50 times more than foreseen in 1914. Industrialists like Renault, Ford, Krupp, and Citroën grow wealthy. In Paris, Citroën's factories churn out 26 million shells. In the infernal din of the cavernous workshops, underpaid women put in 11 hours a day. On the 1st of July 1917, England's King George V arrives on the continent. It's his 400th visit to the front. On the dunes lining the North Sea, the Belgian army pays tribute to him. The Belgian monarch, Albert I, heroically hangs on to what is left of his country. Albert is King George's cousin. Both are of German origin, descendants of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. But King George has decided to change his name. Henceforth, the British royal family will be called the House of Windsor. George V is worried. German U-boats are starving the English people and killing countless victims. He must find a way out. The German U-boats patrolling the Atlantic are starving the people of England. Fearful for his citizens, King George V demands that they be stopped at all costs. His solution is to seize the Kaiser's submarine bases in occupied Belgium, at Ostend and Bruges. British military leaders prepare this offensive in Belgium. Their commander is Field Marshal Hayek, nicknamed by his men the Butcher of the Somme. Haig's army has also gone through crisis. 306 British soldiers from the trenches have been executed for refusing to climb these ladders and go over the top to certain death. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, opposes a new offensive in this strategically difficult sector in Flanders, where German defences are stronger than anywhere along the front. George is genuinely appalled that 200,000 British Empire soldiers have already been sacrificed. He wants to wait for the Americans to enter the action. But he fails to convince his military leaders. Rigid and blinkered, they are incapable of imagining other strategies. They have planned the coming assault in minute detail, using these models of the battlefield. The objective is to break through the German lines near the Belgian village of Passchendaele. On the 31st of July 1917, the offensive begins. It is a repetition of the same insane scenario tried again and again over the last 3 years. This time, the British artillery unleashes a barrage of 4 million shells, 4 times more than in the Battle of the Somme. After 15 days of shelling, the tanks are sent in, just as they were the year before along the Somme, but in far greater numbers. 100 Mark IV tanks, 30-ton monsters fitted with 3 machine guns or 2 cannons. They flatten the barbed wire, opening the way for 2 British armies, supported on their flank by French units, to launch an attack on the German positions. Despite heavy enemy fire, the Allied advance is spectacular. Until, suddenly, the Allies are stopped in their tracks by weather unheard of in late July. A freak rainstorm turns the bombed-out terrain into a sea of mud, as described by Captain Edwin Vaughan of the 1st Warwickshire Regiment. Moaning from all sides, the wounded crawl into the craters for protection. The rain continues. The water rises in the holes. Unable to move, the wounded drown. An officer weeps next to me. My men are in shock. I have to climb over bodies. A hand rises and grasps onto me. Horrified, I pull out a living man from the pile of corpses. The tanks become stuck in the mud and are easy prey for the German 77 field guns. The Germans strip the disabled tanks and salvage whatever they can. Because of the Allied blockade, Germany has run out of steel to manufacture tanks. September 1917. Military leaders persist with their plans. Week after week, Field Marshal Haig relaunches the attack. But the clay soil remains waterlogged, and all attacks fail. The telephone lines have been cut. Only carrier pigeons can get through the hail of gunfire. They deliver the dreadful news to Haig, who plays down the extent of the disaster in reports to the government. In Haig's plan, the town of Passchendaele was to be captured in a few hours on the first day of the offensive. It takes 3 months. The town is finally occupied after bloody street-to-street fighting by the Canadians. Private Arthur Lapointe of the Vendeus says, "Passchendaele, it looks like a town struck by a terrible cataclysm. These fields of death will never see life again." "217,194 British Empire soldiers have died to advance 5 miles. German deaths number nearly 300,000. British Prime Minister Lloyd George says, "Passchendaele will forever rank among the biggest, bloodiest, and most useless battles in history." The Canadian field surgeon John McCrae writes in Flanders Fields, one of the most moving poems ever penned about the war. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die. We shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
And there's more memorable images from history next on 5 Select. The horrifying campaign is drawing to a close, and the whole world will never be the same again as World War I in colour concludes.
It has been 3 years since the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set the empires of Europe against each other. Millions have died in his name, and the terrible consequences of war have been felt on each side. Much of Europe lies in ruin. As the hatred between the nations grows, the Great War rages on. Autumn 1917. The United States has joined Great Britain, France, Belgium, Russia, Japan, and Italy. Italy is battling the Austrians to conquer the cities of Trento and Trieste. In the Alps, the Italian troops face terrible hardships. They are under the draconian command of officers led by General Luigi Cadorna. The military hierarchy is merciless. 750 soldiers are shot by firing squad for disobedience. Every day, these Italian soldiers accomplish incredible feats, such as carrying cannons up 10,000-foot mountains. Cannons that are meant to dislodge the Austrian enemy. Even in the Alps, the established defensive tactics of this war persist: barbed wire and trenches. Except that here, the men have dug them into the ice. With their bayonets, they carve altars for their chaplain to deliver Mass. After repeated Italian offensives, the outnumbered Austrians hold their positions, but request support from the Kaiser's army. On the 24th of October 1917, German reinforcements arrive. Among them is Lieutenant and future Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He and his men infiltrate the Italian lines. He says, "The deeper we penetrate enemy positions, the less they expect it, and the easier the battle." Rommel takes huge numbers of prisoners. It's the beginning of the end for the Italian front. German and Austrian troops pour down from the mountains and take the city of Caporetto. In less than 10 days, they advance 60 miles. Early November 1917. The Germans and Austrians push forward amidst the debris of the Italian army. "275,000 Italian soldiers surrender. Many shout, 'Our enemy is Cadorna, not the Austrians.' General Cadorna says, 'My army has gone on strike.' He is stripped of his command. The carnage of Caporetto was evoked by Ernest Hemingway in his novel A Farewell to Arms. At 19, he was a volunteer in an Italian ambulance unit. Hemingway writes, "I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice. The sacrifices here were like the stockyards at Chicago. There were many words that you cannot stand to hear. Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hallow were obscene." This spirit of revolt, fanned by the defeat at Caporetto, leads to an emergency conference of Allied leaders who worry that Italy might withdraw from the war. On the 15th of November 1917, they decide to send reinforcements who are welcomed as saviors. 100,000 French and British troops are assigned to stop the German and Austrian advance towards Venice. France also sends an air squadron. The French aviators enjoy the perks of this posting. The Allies stop the Austrians and take many prisoners. These soldiers, encompassing all the various peoples of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, are tired of war. There are rumblings of mutiny, of independence. Their emperor Karl I meets with the Kaiser Wilhelm II. They travel to the front to appraise the situation. The emperor is increasingly worried that the revolt will spread. He continues to favor peace and wants to negotiate. But not the Kaiser. He still dreams of a victory that could save him. The Kaiser says, after the war, we will conclude a major treaty with France, and then with all of Europe. That done, I will lead the real war against England. The Kaiser and his generals believe they must achieve victory before the Americans are fully operational. The first step is to get Russia out of the war so German armies can be redeployed from the eastern to the western front. With this in mind, General Ludendorff, still in charge in Germany, facilitates the return of Russia's leading political agitator to St. Petersburg, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin. Author of writings that advocate a communist takeover, Lenin has been living in exile in Switzerland. The Germans cunningly decide to finance both Lenin's party and this journey, because the communists, who deposed the Tsar in February of 1917, are still fighting the war. This unnatural alliance is not because Ludendorff supports Lenin's plan to ban private property, but because Lenin claims he will take Russia out of the war. Ludendorff says, Lenin will overthrow the Russian patriots, and then I will strangle him and all his friends. In a Russia crushed by war, a Russia of misery, famine, and with an army in chaos, Lenin says, peace, bread, land, and freedom are necessary for the masses. Lenin accuses Kerensky's provisional government of prolonging the imperialist butchery. The 7th of November 1917, Lenin and his followers overthrow the provisional government. The sudden, brutal arrests will establish a bloody and implacable dictatorship. Lenin had written a decade earlier, during the 1905 revolution, terror is an instrument of social hygiene. Among the early victims of this policy are the imperial family, who are all executed. The Romanov dynasty is the first to fall as a result of the war. The 15th of December 1917, German and Russian soldiers emerge from their trenches, cross the barbed wire, and fraternize. The new communist regime in Moscow has just signed an armistice and undertakes negotiations to end the war. Lenin says, "We must come to a compromise with the imperialist bandits." In Brest-Litovsk, at a train station 65 miles from Warsaw, peace talks begin on the 22nd of December 1917. The Germans mockingly welcome the communists, who harbor no illusions about the territorial concessions they will be forced to make. In Lenin's view, territory has to be forfeited in order to gain time. Time to allow the revolution to consolidate, as civil war is brewing with the Russian armies that remain faithful to imperial rule. The communists must gain time. They hope that the revolution will spread around the world. For 3 months, they negotiate with their enemies from Germany, Austria, Turkey, and Bulgaria. With Germany threatening to resume the war against Russia, Lenin sends Leon Trotsky, one of his closest comrades, to capitulate on every point. The peace treaty is signed on the 3rd of March, 1918. Russia loses almost 400,000 square miles of its territory and a quarter of its population, from the Balkans to Poland, which regains its independence, and Ukraine, which promptly enters the war against the Bolsheviks. Ludendorff has succeeded. He can transfer much of his army to the Western Front. For Wilhelm Hindenburg and Ludendorff, it's a whole new game. In March 1918, a battered and starving Germany begins massing 2 million troops on the Western Front. The Germans now outnumber the enemy. The High Command realizes its dream of 1914, uniting its forces to overpower the French and British with a series of offensives along the entire front. Ludendorff repeats, "We must strike before the Americans can throw their forces into the scale." He decides on the 21st of March 1918 to try a new tactic. After a short period of shelling to prepare the attack, his shock troops, following the example of the young Rommel in Caporetto, infiltrate the enemy lines. The war of movement resumes. For the first time since the trench warfare began, the Allied front is breached. And just 3 days later, the Germans are 75 miles from Paris. For the last 6 months, Parisians have lived in fear of German airplanes, the twin-engine Gothas. These planes are the world's first strategic bombers. They replace the Zeppelins that have terrorized London and Paris. Despite air raid sirens and shelters, 200 Parisians are killed by bombs from German airplanes. To the north, Canadians and Australian troops help evacuate civilians. The situation is so dire that the British, French, and Belgians decide to unite their forces under a single command. Marshal Pétain is widely admired. But the head of the French government, Georges Clemenceau, called the Tiger, considers Pétain too cautious. Pétain has declared, "I'm waiting for the tanks and the Americans." The political and military leaders of the Allied coalition agree on the 14th of April 1918 on a supreme commander of their armies, General Ferdinand Foch, who declares, "Victory is a thing of the will." Foch visits American headquarters east of Paris to ask General Pershing to engage all his forces in the war. Pershing refuses. The meeting is stormy, despite the smiles for the camera. Pershing says his troops won't be operational before 1919. Exasperated, Foch asks him if he intends to sit it out until the French and British have been defeated. Pershing does not want to sacrifice his men in trench warfare. He's preparing for another kind of combat, open warfare, a war of movement over vast areas and in the sky. Suddenly, fighter pilots are on every front page. Stories of their aircraft and exploits reassure those at home and earn them much admiration. A former automobile racer and Pershing's personal chauffeur, Eddie Rickenbacker becomes an ace with 26 victories. He says, "Courage is doing what you are afraid to do." He survives the terrible dogfights in the sky, but the most famous French airman, Georges Guynemer, is shot down. Other flying aces make history, such as France's René Fonck with 75 victories, and Canada's Billy Bishop. Their most feared adversary is the German ace Manfred von Richthofen, who racks up 80 victories. He is one of the rare pilots to comment on the real meaning of air combat victories. Von Richthofen says, "The murder of a man is still a murder, even in wartime." His noble Prussian blood and the color of his airplane earn him the nickname the Red Baron. He flies a three-winged fighter, the famous Fokker triplane, remarkable for its maneuverability and speed. Von Richthofen develops a new tactic with the other pilots of his squadron. He describes it. "With my bright red plane, I serve as bait. I fly very low. My pilots lie in wait above, ready to dive on any enemy plane that goes for me." On the 21st of April 1918, Richthofen prepares for takeoff. He loads the two machine guns, which are synchronized to fire through the propeller. Flying above the British lines, pursued by an enemy pilot, he descends too low. He is shot in the heart by an Australian anti-aircraft gun. The victory over the German ace is also claimed by the pilot who was in pursuit, the Canadian Roy Brown, seen here posing with Richthofen's two machine guns to prove it. 6 British pilots carry the German ace to his final resting place, in the New Zealand section of the graveyard. Maori rituals are performed to help his soul on its journey. The loss of the Red Baron hits Germans hard. The German advance becomes bogged down because logistics cannot keep up. Supplies do not arrive. The men are hungry. To improve morale, Kaiser Wilhelm II hands out the Iron Cross to his soldiers, but he is visibly worried. His men have still not broken the enemy lines once and for all, and will soon find themselves under heavy fire. In the Meuse, at San Mihail, in what has been a quiet sector, a German unit surprises an American position. The Americans lose 650 men. General Pershing is furious. He orders a counterattack, in which a future president of the United States, Artillery Captain Harry Truman, distinguishes himself. The Americans take the German trenches. They prove their ability to fight in this hell. They film their first prisoners. Pershing has kept his soldiers from being amalgamated into the combined Allied regiments. But he can't keep them out of hand-to-hand combat to defend their positions, as here at Bois-Boileau, near Reims, on the 26th of June 1918. The Marines have stopped the German advance, but at a terrible cost. The US Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, witnessed the fighting. He writes to Wilson, "The Marines fought according to American methods, in successive waves, passing over the bodies of their dead comrades and plunging ahead, until they too should be torn to bits. In all the history of the Marine Corps, there is no such battle as that one, fighting day and night without sleep, often without water, and for days without hot rations. They lost 3/4 of their companies." On the 15th of July 1918, the Germans received the order to resume their advance. The High Command says, "It's the Friedensturm, the offensive for peace." The shock troops know they will now be facing the Americans too, soldiers not exhausted from 4 years of war, and who have every military resource at their disposal. General Ludendorff knows that he no longer has numerical superiority. It's all or nothing. With American soldiers now fully engaged in the war, the Germans find themselves outgunned and outnumbered. Left with no other option, General Ludendorff orders one final offensive in hopes of turning Germany away from the brink of defeat. He launches his last divisions, 600,000 men on either side of Reims towards Paris. The Second Battle of the Marne has begun. The Germans advance through the same wheat fields as in August 1914. Suddenly, ahead of them, French troops. To the Slaughterhouse is a book by the soldier Jean Giono, who writes, "They had watched as all the men left. It was a thick summer night, smelling of corn and horse sweat. This war was to be the war to end all wars. The last war ever. It was the war to kill off war. But it killed only men, pointlessly. All wars are pointless." Marshal Foch mounts a powerful Allied counteroffensive, comprising 1 million men and 500 tanks. The British Mark IVs, the French Renault FTs, also used by the Americans, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Patton. A prelude to the combined tank warplane tactics of the next war. This wounded soldier could easily be the main character of the novel Johnny Got His Gun. A young American soldier, he loses all his limbs, his sight, his speech, but not his consciousness. On the 8th of August 1918, Allied tanks overrun the enemy, so close to Paris. The German army, lacking tanks and reserve troops, completely collapses. They lose 150,000 men, including 40,000 taken prisoner. Ludendorff dubs it the Black Day of the German army. His offensive for peace has failed, but he has no choice except to try to delay for as long as possible the Allied advance towards the German border, the great empires, Tita. Austria-Hungary braces for the onslaught of the Army of the Orient. Troops from France, Great Britain, Italy, Serbia and Greece set out for Salonika to reconquer the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire is also under threat, with the British advancing on Damascus. With support from Arab tribes, the British complete their conquest of Turkish-ruled Palestine. On the 30th of September 1918, warriors from Arabia enter Damascus, led by Emir Faisal, the son of Hussein, Prince of Mecca. He owes his victory to his bravery, and also to his mysterious advisor, Thomas Edward Lawrence, a British intelligence agent. His mission was to foment an Arab revolt against the Turks by providing them with money and weapons. Lawrence is 30. He speaks Arabic and has adopted local clothing to be less conspicuous. He later writes, "The British Army uniform was abominable when camel riding or when sitting about on the ground. Arab clothing was cleaner and more decent." He loves the desert with a passion and has become a guerrilla leader. In his book, The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he writes, "The Arab respected force a little. He respected craft more, and often had it in enviable degree. But most of all, he respected blunt sincerity of utterance. But the British go back on their commitment by divvying up with the French the Ottoman Empire that they had promised to Faisal. Syria and Lebanon go to the French, and the English create a new country, Iraq. As consolation, they install Faisal on the throne of this oil-rich nation. But Faisal cannot forgive the man known from here on as Lawrence of Arabia for going back on his promise to return to him the vast realm of his distant ancestors who, in the 8th century, had conquered a good part of the world in the name of Islam. Equally galling to the Arabs, when the British conquered Jerusalem, they showed support for the Jewish population of Palestine. The British government has made promises to them too. But despite all this, the First World War is not over. France, early October 1918. The east and north of the country lie in ruins. Foch's powerful counter-offensives advance along the entire front. The Americans attack in the Argonne region, the French in the Meuse, in Champagne and in Picardy. The British armies, along with the Australian cavalry, advance towards Cambrai. The Belgians and Canadians march on Mons. Germany crumbles under the brutal Allied assault. Many Germans surrender when their final effort to hold the line fails. Their leaders still try to convince them that defeat is impossible. But many are too young for battle, or too old. Most feel only relief. There's no need for battlefield propaganda now. Camera crews go back to Germany to film the revolution. Sailors are mutinying. Workers' councils control the major cities. Ludendorff feels his power slipping. In private, he speaks of armistice, but in public, he defends the army's record. On the 25th of October 1918, Ludendorff issues a proclamation. For us, as soldiers, capitulation is unacceptable. We must resist with all our might. This is the beginning of the legend known as the stab in the back. For both Ludendorff and Hitler, the army had not been defeated by the enemy, but by the politicians. A new government under the socialists strips Ludendorff of his command. He flees to Sweden. On the 29th of October 1918, Wilhelm II travels to Spa in Belgium, to his general headquarters, to make sure the army is behind him. But the regime in Berlin has changed and now demands his abdication. No one, least of all Wilson, wants to negotiate with the man seen as one of the main instigators of the war. On the 9th of November 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates and seeks refuge in the Netherlands. It's the end for the great empires and their monarchs. The golden imperial carriage of Austria is sold off. The Viennese no longer swoon at the sight of the beautiful Princess Zita. They are too weak from hunger. As is the Austro-Hungarian army, defeated by the Italians at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The massive Austro-Hungarian Empire sinks, as does its greatest battleship, the 20,000-ton St. Istvan, torpedoed by the Italians. Emperor Karl goes into exile with Zita. On the 11th of November 1918, Marshal Foch's special train enters the station of Compiègne, north of Paris. In this carriage, hidden from the cameras, the envoys of the Provisional German government sign the armistice. Germany accepts defeat and requests an end to hostilities. After 4 years of brutal war, leaving unimaginable destruction and a death toll of over 18 million, Europe is finally at peace. On the front, the ceasefire is set for 11 a.m. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It has lasted 4 years. 80 million men were mobilized. 10 million soldiers were killed. 20 million more were wounded, and 8 million civilians died. There's not a family that doesn't count someone killed, amputated, gassed, or orphaned. But around the world, joy erupts when Germany surrenders on the 11th of November 1918. Across Europe, governments shape the memory of the war by commissioning countless monuments that depict their soldiers marching towards sacrifice and glory. They never depict the firing squads and repression imposed to keep order in the ranks. Despite the mass slaughter, these monuments almost always seek to convince us that it is right to kill and to be killed for one's homeland. On the 13th of December 1918 in Paris, Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau and his entire government await the arrival of an exceptional visitor, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. This is the first time in history that a President of the United States leaves his country and crosses the Atlantic. But the situation is grave. The armistice has been signed, but peace must be made. Many questions remain open. Countless conflicts arise. And now America has a place at the table. Wilson's first official act is, of course, to inspect his troops. He says to Pershing, "I'm not sure everyone is glad to see me." Wilson is aware that because of its role at the bargaining table, America is now a dominant figure on the world stage. Wilson champions what he calls the right of nations to self-determination. This ideal opens the door to numerous demands for nationhood and the drawing of new borders. His second act is one of compassion. He travels to Reims to witness the unimaginable damage to the cathedral. Wilson surveys the extent of the disaster. He says, "The whole world is sick to the heart at the sight of the beautiful cities and fields of France struck by catastrophe. 7.5 million acres of land are no longer fit for agriculture. It is forever polluted from chemical warfare, the millions of artillery shells, and the countless corpses that will have to be collected and buried." Refugees just want to go home. They try, but hundreds of villages have been wiped from the map. never again, proclaim the pacifist movements. The Americans, the French, and the British come up with the idea of an international body designed to avoid war in the future. They call it the League of Nations. On the 28th of June 1919, at the Palace of Versailles, 5 years to the day after the assassination in Sarajevo, delegates from all the nations that were at war with Germany sit down together. After lengthy negotiations, they are ready to sign the peace treaty. The famous Hall of Mirrors has been chosen for the signing. It was here that Wilhelm I was crowned Emperor of Germany after defeating France in 1871. In this highly symbolic setting, the German representatives must sign the Treaty of Versailles, which is imposed by the victors. Hitler will later call it the Diktat. The Allies divide up Germany's colonies among themselves and impose harsh war reparations. The treaty has many critics. The renowned British economist John Maynard Keynes writes, "If we take the view that Germany must be kept impoverished and her children starved and crippled, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp." But for Clemenceau, what matters above all is the return of Alsace-Lorraine to France, with the rich coal fields of the Saar Valley. Austro-Hungary ceases to exist, with some areas going to Italy and others becoming new countries between 1919 and 1922. Germany is divided in two by the Polish corridor, intended to give Poland access to the sea. Russia is excluded from the treaty. After a bloody civil war, it becomes the Soviet Union, the USSR. Wilson sails back home. Americans are hostile to the treaty, and Congress fails to ratify it. The senator from Pennsylvania, Philander Knox, tells Wilson, "Mr. President, I am convinced, after the most painstaking consideration that I can give, that this treaty does not spell peace, but war. War more woeful and devastating than the one we have but now closed. The United Kingdom is the only great empire to survive." King George V, his Prime Minister Lloyd George, and Marshal Foch embrace their roles as victors. But there is division among them. The priority for the British is to prevent the return of war, whereas in the eyes of the French, Germany must be punished. A whole generation of German children will grow up humiliated and dreaming of revenge.
And it's a change of gear next on 5 Select as we move forward to modern times with a team of officers tackling an ever-present menace on the roads in all new traffic cops.